Thank you, everyone, for coming. Real pleasure here. Pleasure to be here. So I couldn't resist the fire graphic. It's only on the first slide, so don't worry. A year ago, it all began then. A year ago, I taught a new French studies course called Banned Books. I was becoming more and more interested in the stakes around freedom of speech and freedom of thought in France. And in October, there's that flyer. In October of this past year, I gave a talk in France. It was called Banned in the USA, and it was about the politicization of books and knowledge here, requested by a French audience, curious to know what's been happening here since January 2025 from an insider, the point in which the US had stepped onto the precipice. And in the Q&A after that talk, a student expressed fear over the state of affairs that I had just described, and she asked how she could help people like me. Before she finished, she started crying uncontrollably, and I suddenly saw myself in her eyes. I was the frog in the boiling water. And I comforted her by explaining that I could still research and teach at my university, and that I probably could continue to do so because it might never occur to the Department of Education that race and gender can be studied in a foreign language. But the French don't need me. Let's see the arrows. The French don't need me to alert them to the US government and the MAGA movement's attempts to ban books, suppress the media, repress academic freedom, or cancel science. French journalists are doing a good job informing the public. And so are French academics. And like Canada, some French universities are beginning to recruit American academics in what will likely become an epic brain drain. But if I came here to tell you how bad we looked abroad, I wouldn't be adding much value to your day. So let's look instead about how knowledge might be under fire in France. And I proposed this talk to open the Scientia series this year, which I loved when I saw it first, to global perspectives. And I will try to do these 7 things in 20 or 25 minutes, and you can have a look at that while I turn my page. It's a tall order. But I'll start with freedom of expression, which of course includes freedom of the printed word. Freedom of the press came rather late to France. During the old regime, information was subject to state control. The French Revolution shook things up with the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, instituting freedoms of opinion, of thought, of speech, and the press. These were all, though, quickly repressed again and stayed so throughout most of the 19th century. But finally, in 1881, did a law grant freedom of the press. It's still in effect today, ending the obligation of the media or any organ to have the state pre-authorize anything that was to be printed. And yet the press was to be censored again in times of crisis, the 2 world wars. Finally, you might be surprised to learn that the French radio and television were controlled by state monopolies up until 1981, so a full 100 years after that press law. But let's look at books instead of the press and other forms of media. In history, books for adults were censored in France, mostly for reasons of sexuality or immorality, or for critiques of religious or political authorities. But today, controversies around fiction in France are generally limited to children's literature. And we can't understand the present without a little bit of a dive back into the past. It was in the 1930s, the 1930s invasion of American comic strips that stoked fear and loathing among French adults. A fear that was one of, ultimately, of Americanization, a fear of violence and immorality, and a fear of decline in children's literacy. Catholic presses led the comic strip resistance, and they found strange bedfellows with communists who were more concerned with American imperialism embedded behind those comic strips. The conflict culminated in a 1949 law that regulated all children's reading material. And here are just two versions of the law. You can see the old one and the new. The law banned content that favorably presented, and I'll quote, criminality, lying, stealing, laziness, cowardice, hate, debauchery, and any crime or offense that might corrupt childhood or youth. It was part child welfare, part economic protectionism, part censorship. But its punitive measures were only to be taken a posteriori. So to avoid trouble, presses could publish whatever they wanted, but they would have to make careful decisions about what to publish to avoid the commission of surveillance coming after them after publication. Many consider that the law's legacy, still in effect today, has been one of self-censorship on the part of publishers. The 1949 law has been revised nearly a dozen times to evolve with changing mores and changing technology. No longer is the promotion of laziness a cause for alarm, but instead, apologists' portrayals of pornography, drugs, and hate crimes are prohibited. The number of cases brought before the Surveillance Commission has dwindled to almost nothing since the 2000s, except for an exception that I'll get back to in a minute. Now, the US has never had such a law regulating the content of children's publishing. We do have a rating system, as you know, for television and movies for children, but nothing really for printed material. This lack of legislation does not mean, however, that American society is less restrictive than France, au contraire. And nor is American society less prone to controversy and politicization of children's books. And here we have Tucker Carlson outraged that the Zeus Foundation decided not to reissue some of its books. But back to the 1949 law, this is the kind of reference that needs to be on the copyright page of every children's book. And it's the third and fourth line where you can see reference to the law. And that reference is a way for publishers to show that they are abiding by the terms of that law. Now, of course, this being France, those terms are subject to interpretation. Several, I like to call them badass publishers, purposefully challenge norms, notably around nudity and sexuality. But at the same time, controversies have erupted over some picture books that took many French people by surprise. And so let's maintain a chronological order. I'll go through a couple of books. You might have read Pippi Longstocking, and here's my first circulation. Can I hand it to you, Jason? For the 1962 and the 1995 version of Fifi Brin d'Acier, the French translation of the Swedish. Here is an example of a form of censorship that endured for over 30 years. While American children got to experience Pippi in her full hilarity and savagery, generations of French kids were reading a version of Astrid Lindgren's international bestseller that had been cut by 4 entire chapters, several pages in other chapters, full paragraphs at a time, many passages sanitized. In total, the French version contained 77% of the original Swedish version. Why? Fifi was considered a poor moral influence on French children. And it was only in 1995 when Lindgren was informed of the massacre that had been done to her original text. Nobody told her, nobody knew maybe, and she threatened to retake her copyright, and that's when Hachette finally agreed to do a new translation. Another book, I don't have it because it's very hard to find, thanks to Fondren ILL, was very controversial, not for reasons you might suspect from the title, actually. The author is an extremely well-known comic artist, son of a Syrian father and a French mother. And here in this title, he described a bit of his childhood in Syria, where he experienced, or he depicted in the book, anti-Semitic and sexist comments exchanged by child protagonists in the story. He was accused after publication of poorly representing Syria and Islam. And in response, there's an editor's note in this version I had, and I'll translate it. It was written, "This book tells a true story in a country where a totalitarian regime formats children to a single mode of thought. It is against circumcision. It is not an incitement to racial hatred, but bears witness to how a society produces racial hatred." Moving on, going in order. Everybody Get Naked. This was published in 2011. It's a story about the human body with page after page of various people getting undressed, and they're identified by usually their socio-professional category. Teacher, police officer, this is the CEO. This is my favorite page. It went completely unnoticed for about 3 years until a far-right politician denounced it in a television talk show. And then it became a little bit of a scandal, and of course, sales skyrocketed. Final example, Bien trop petit. I can circulate this one. This is more of YA literature. Thank you. This is the first time in a long time the 1949 Law Surveillance Commission did something, and it banned this book. It banned it for minors. So this is really probably the only book ban we've seen in a long time, but banned to minors, of course. And it was all very shocking. A lot of ink spilled in the literary world in France, a lot of petitions, European literary world spread. The title refers to the size of the boy protagonist's genitals. And there's, several sex scenes in there. Meant to actually quite educate young readers about sexuality and all kinds of moral discussions around sex scenes. And so what I'm circulating is the second edition that was after the ban. And so you will notice on the copyright page that reference to the 1949 law simply doesn't appear. And on the back cover, you'll see what looks kind of like a middle finger to the Surveillance Commission. If somebody has it, you'll see it's written there like, this may violate the morality of some children or not, is what it says on there. So I guess they had the right to put that on the back cover. But I'll halt these examples of individual books that created various scandals in France to focus on some concepts that have been challenging French publishers in recent years. And here are those concepts. These are all considered by many French people to be variations of censorship, and they are all considered to be American imports. Over the last decade or so, the French have watched aghast as various Anglophone authors have been attacked for cultural appropriation. And what is it? We all probably think we know it, and we do, but I'll just throw out some defining terms for it. But I do think an extreme branch of cultural appropriation attacks suggest that fiction authors should not create characters or stories that are other than one's own background, let's say of race, nationality, gender identity. Or another omerta is on authors who have not lived through certain experiences, such as colonialism, rape, war, handicap. They should not create characters or plots featuring those experiences. And in my view, these kinds of attacks are actually minor. They are a minority viewpoint within a larger set of critiques that would like to see literature more diversified and would like to see more diverse voices in literature. And so I just want to use an example of one picture book, also don't have this one, Samiha and les fantômes. It's Samiha and the Ghosts, we could simply translate, 2010. It's the only picture book I've ever come across that addresses Muslim head coverings. And in this case, it's the full body burqa. And in this case, the story is about that. That is the subject. And the story's Western approach, the way the author wrote it, clearly denounces the girl protagonist's fate when she would ultimately be obliged by her uncle to cover herself, making it difficult for her to play, to study, or to breathe. As you can see, it was endorsed by Amnesty International. It didn't get much press when it first came out, but whatever press it did get was generally positive. Now, a dozen or so years later, the author herself, who is both a children's author and an academic, a French woman, she began to write about her regret, realizing that the book might be more Islamophobic than feminist, as she had intended, and decided with her publisher that the book should not be reprinted. She said that she didn't have the book at the time read by any sensitivity readers, another of those concepts, and she now considers her own white, non-Muslim French voice illegitimate to be discussing the topic, and that it might have been legitimate only if she had done more research or if she had conducted sensitivity readers, or, I like this term in French, les personnes concernées, which is an interesting way, I haven't really found an English equivalent, maybe others have, of members of a group who can and should speak for themselves, in other words. So, while readers wait for publishing to welcome more diversified authors, more diverse voices, an alternate solution has emerged, this concept of sensitivity readings. And as you probably already know, the idea is that for an author who does dare to create characters who are not members of her own community or have experiences in the plots for which the author had not had the same experience, that they could consult someone from that community or someone who had had that experience to verify that the fictional text does not contain errors of fact or offensive representations. So this is the notion of consulting an expert on a subject with which you might not be familiar. It's something we do in research all the time. There's a difference between research and fiction, of course. We call it peer review. Now, many French publishers and writers think that sensitivity reading, or certainly the obligation to do it, which I don't think ever really exists as an obligation, are a form of censorship. Just want to talk about Alma. I can circulate that too. YA, more than a picture book here. This book really reveals in stark contrast the differing, if we generalize, French and American attitudes towards cultural appropriation. This is the first book in a best-selling trilogy published by the prestigious Gallimard, and it was declined by its normal American publisher, for it was a story about slavery written by a white French man. And it was ultimately translated into English, but by a British publisher. And much ink was spilt in French literary circles over this news that an American publisher had declined to translate it. Much ink was spilt over this notion of American judgment of cultural appropriation against a French author. And I'm not taking sides on any of these, just revealing cultural differences between our two societies. And of course, generalizing, not all French think this, not all Americans think that. I'll switch gears and conclude with a few adult topics. Back to freedom of speech. While it is a given in the French Republic today, it is subject to certain restrictions. It is not free speech at all costs, and most French agree that freedom without limits is not freedom, but just licentiousness. And what are the limits? So I'll just name a few. Fake news is against the law in France. Racist and discriminatory discourse against any person because of their belonging or non-belonging to a social category, an ethnicity, nationality, race, sexual orientation, handicap is against the law. Holocaust denial is prohibited. A Nazi salute considered an endorsement of crimes against humanity is a crime in France. And now people break the law all the time in France, break this law in France. But they are held accountable by courts of justice. And sometimes we may agree or disagree with those conclusions, but usually there's a court case. And in this, you have the founder of the far-right National Front Party back in the 80s who was describing the Holocaust gas chambers as a detail. And he was convicted of that speech. Switch to a different topic. Charlie Hebdo. Some of you might be familiar with this weekly satirical newspaper filled with insider jokes that even few French can understand. It's especially known for its offensive portrayals, caricatures, or cartoons of every social or political category you can imagine, but especially religious and political figures. Not only Muslims, but Jews, Catholics, right, left, women. It's terribly misogynist. In 2006 and 2012, Charlie Hebdo published caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad, and as a result faced some court cases as well as terrorist threats for years. And it was in 2015 that two men acting in the name of Al-Qaeda entered the newspaper's offices and gunned down 12 people. It was a major terrorist attack in the middle of Paris that shocked French society. Questions arose. Was the publication free speech or hate speech? Satire or insult? Can Islam be criticized without rejecting or harming Muslims? This is what the legal courts have to decide. In the immediate aftermath of Charlie Hebdo, the murderous terror attacks, a massive majority of French rallied to the cause of free speech, embodied in that slogan, Je suis Charlie, I am for free speech. But a decade later, here today, I would say that France is quite divided over these questions. And now I want to talk to you about something called Islamo-gauchisme. Some of you may have heard of this term, Islamo-leftism. But you might know that, step back, that in France, probably the most major social tension is not around race, but around the place of Muslims in secular/Catholic France. And French social scientists have been studying this issue for nearly a century. And a few years ago, this term, Islamo-gauchism or Islamo-leftism, hit the public consciousness. It was an invented term by the far right that makes the outrageous accusation that academic research into the failures of French society to integrate Muslim citizens, that research is an act of sympathizing with religious fundamentalism and with Islamist jihad. And in 2021, a sub-minister for higher education proposed an inquiry, in fact, into the influence of Islamo-gauchism in French social science research. The word McCarthyism was on everyone's lips. And to American scholars momentarily comfortable under the Biden administration, this proposed inquiry, which was immediately dropped, was a shocking example of democratic sliding across the Atlantic. Now, Islamo-gauchisme is, I would say, quite similar to wokeness or le wokisme, at least in the eyes of its opponents. The French consider, again, the United States, and they are not the only ones to think this, as the birthplace of the politically correct, which has been rebranded as woke, and its attendant cancel culture. Anti-wokers consider wokeism as a form of knowledge under fire, their knowledge under fire. Their lament is, you can't say anything anymore. On ne peut plus rien dire, as they say in French. An astonishing amount of publications have been coming out on the subject. These are book covers. This would be an excellent student project. anyone interested. But not all of these titles are critical of progressive tolerance. And the last topic, if I'm okay on timing, around knowledge under fire that I would like to raise is the question of media concentration today and extremism in the media. For decades, I used to tell my students in my course on the media in France, there's no such thing as Fox News in France. There's no such thing as MSNBC. Alas, this is no longer true. There is a 1986 law and much public and political will to safeguard objectivity and truth in the media and to avoid excessive concentration of media ownership. But these protections are not enough to preserve the delicate balance of a diverse and independent media from a diverse and independent media landscape from the personal will of a couple of billionaires. And Vincent Bolloré is one of those billionaires. I would call him the Rupert Murdoch of the Francophone world. He now owns multiple media outlets in television, radio, press, book publishing, the internet, etc. And this graphic shows some of those companies that he owns now. It's from the Observatory of Multinationals. Furthermore, his outlets are disseminating extreme xenophobic and anti-democratic views, as well as fake news. And they have been fined pretty regularly by the state media regulator. And Bolloré himself has been accused of multiple instances of intervening in censoring content and imposing his will in editorial decisions among some of these publications. He's not the only billionaire doing so in France. Keep your ears out for someone else named Pierre-Édouard Stérin, who I would call a Catholic Peter Thiel. Meanwhile, on the internet, we do have the European Union to thank for doing its imperfect best to protect citizens' rights to reliable information with the Digital Services Act that was passed in 2024, protecting equal transmission of diverse viewpoints, accountability for media companies to moderate content, checking algorithms. In conclusion, is knowledge under fire in France? No, but, or I could say yes, but I'll go with no, but. No, but. Knowledge in France has been singed at various times through history. Access to knowledge and information is marked by some limits, and smoke is rising on a number of fronts. But can French exceptionalism steer the way towards strengthened democracy in a world under threat of totalitarianism? Let's never forget that book burnings were an integral part of Nazi propaganda in 1933. So I hope you found this overview a stimulating respite from the news about American knowledge under fire. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. The respite is over. I'm really actually very grateful for the opportunity to speak under the banner of Knowledge Under Fire, because so much is on fire today, and perhaps even more than members of the Institute anticipated when selecting this theme. The Middle East is under fire from bombs dropped by US tax dollars. The global climate crisis is escalating wildly. Diseases like measles, diphtheria, and polio are resurging. COVID never went away. American cities are under siege. ICE is policing accents. A lot that Americans took for granted in the mid to late 20th century is now imperiled. Clean water, clean air, functioning airports. Abortion is banned or restricted in much of the country. Social media has eroded the conditions for civic literacy. Meanwhile, a growing billionaire class divests from the public interest, even as their interests dominate public policy. As historian Nikhil Pal Singh puts it, it's a constant stream of violence, corruption, spectacle, characterized by what the US president and his defense secretary call kinetic action, moving fast and breaking things all the time. So what are we to do? We ordinary folk whose efforts to reuse and recycle will do nothing to halt global warming. We citizens who oppose war but whose protests go unheeded. We humanists who value community, art, and knowledge. As so much around us comes under fire, it can be tempting to withdraw into the comforting alibi of our irrelevance. But in fact, underlying all of these crises are systematic attacks on expert knowledge, the diminution of the professional status of educators at all levels, and perversions of the values of responsibility, integrity, and care for others. Which means that we academics are not irrelevant at all. We are on the front lines. So in what follows, I'm going to approach that front line from 3 angles. I'll start by addressing the literature classroom of my talk title by sharing just a tiny thread from my recent literary studies monograph, Overdetermined. Overdetermined is an attempt to chart a way out of some of our conventional habits in the study and teaching of literature. And that book's key questions arise not exactly from literary texts themselves, but from real-life professional and pedagogical situations. In this way, the book performs literary scholarship that is experiential and relational and focused on the classroom as a site of collaborative meaning-making. I'm then going to elaborate 2 issues that I think should be of particular concern to all of us who inhabit university classrooms. First, the systematic deprofessionalization of teachers in Houston ISD after the 2023 takeover by the state of the district. And second, the perversion of pedagogical values via the widespread dissemination of AI. Ultimately, what I want to suggest is that our practices and values as members of the university community should pose a powerful counter-argument to the deformations of the dominant culture. A counter-argument to the claim that teachers are interchangeable technicians. A counter-argument to the idea that efficiency is the highest value. A counter-argument to the ideology of individualism that reigns in the United States and much else besides. What would you need to believe about education to advocate for its automation? And what would you need to forget about human intelligence? So let's go first into Overdetermined's classroom. So this book is the product of what, for me, was more than 20 years of thinking about the relationships between literature and identity, research and teaching. And in the book, I use Indian English literature as a case study, describing it as an object that never exactly wears its own name, but instead appears in the garb of formations like the ethnic and post-colonial. Now, ethnic and post-colonial studies are interdisciplinary knowledge projects that have long been subject to disciplining by disciplinary authorities. So it's no coincidence that along with women's studies and gender studies and area studies programs today, these are the fields being surveilled, censored, consolidated. And it bears remembering in this moment the original intent of these field formations, right? To open up the university to new publics, constituencies, knowledges, to marshal the university's tremendous resources, material, infrastructural, epistemological, in service of social justice, informed and equitable citizenship, and the uplift of human potential. The goal was community and activism, not politicking, but putting knowledge into action. So my book tries to use Indian English to examine the terrain of minority literary fields, how they were built up, what's taught in their names, and how the supposedly bad politics of identity inflects our teaching of literary texts by writers who may very well not want to be called ethnic or post-colonial, to students who may or may not recognize themselves in the texts in question. So the book has Indian English in the subtitle, but as you might be able to tell if your eyesight is good from the table of contents, it has broader aims. And every engagement with an author in the book is framed with a syllabus that contextualizes readings, and every section is framed by a story. And when I say story, I mean stories, like a bad, botched teaching moment in which I called a famous writer's material overfamiliar, an article that I had rejected in peer review because my class critique did not land, a discussion I had with a graduate student who didn't want to read canonical post-colonial theorists for his qualifying exam in post-colonial theory. All my stories are true and chosen deliberately. From my teaching misfire, I generate questions about the relationship between ethnic American fiction and the post-Anglophone turn. And from my rejected article, I generate questions about the diasporic desire and resistance to the real India. And the discussion with the graduate student led to an investigation of the legacy of theory. So what I want you to note, please, is that all the examples I've just given are of failures, misfires, and confrontations, right? They're about friction. They're not about perfect summaries and masterful arguments or papers published to applause. They're not about saying the right thing to my students, and they're not about my students telling me what I want to hear. So I'm not interested in romanticizing the literature classroom as a precious space of informed conversation. I'm interested in the kinds of friction that enable us to pursue not disinterested academic questions, but rather social, embodied lines of inquiry. What is a worthy object of study? What is the purpose of literary critique? As novelist Charles Yu writes, we humans are question machines, unlike AIs, which are answer machines. So Overdetermined is about the kinds of questions we're able to ask through and with literature, and about the kinds of intelligence those questions lay bare. Intelligence that is not necessarily measurable, quantifiable, or even definable. So I want to turn now to our local school district, Houston ISD, which was taken over by the Texas Education Agency in 2023. TEA replaced the elected school board with state appointees and installed Superintendent Mike Miles, whose unilateral directives have included filing for status as an innovation district so HISD can hire uncertified teachers, spending $350,000 on billboards, and channeling funds to his bespoke media outlet, HISD Now, which churns out official district propaganda, news, every day via email, text, and app. Now, I'm not an education researcher or a data analyst, and so for that context, I would direct you to Rice's Kinder Institute and the Houston Education Research Consortium. And in fact, HERC's director, Dr. Erin Baumgartner, spoke in this lecture series in September, and you can hear her talk online. I would also encourage you to join us on April 16th for a symposium featuring doctoral candidates who are studying the takeover and its ongoing effects. That event is hosted by an employee resource group that I organize here at Rice, made up of over 50 faculty and staff who call ourselves HISD parents and supporters. As my colleague Caleb McDaniel and I recounted in the Houston Chronicle last year, the TEA takeover is a crisis of local democratic governance that has alienated huge factions of the Houston community. Miles has created a culture of surveillance and micromanagement. Schools are hemorrhaging experienced teachers. Libraries are being converted into discipline areas that are euphemistically called team centers. The appointed school board has overseen the implementation of a system called NES at both struggling schools and high-performing schools that could have been left alone. AI slop has been infused into the curriculum, which is an insult to our students that also creates additional labor for teachers. Coercive mandates direct all learning towards standardized tests. HISD lost 26,000 students in the last 5 years, and that problem is now exacerbated by the federal immigration crackdown and Texas's new voucher program. So these are the facts. But what does it all feel like? What are the affects, the emotions? Well, at the State Commission on the HISD takeover, teachers are testifying through tears because they are being terrorized. Middle schoolers like my daughter are trying to process seeing their teachers disrespected by other adults. High schoolers describe being abandoned mid-year by the teachers they thought were going to write their college recommendations. In almost every meeting I've had with my son's teacher since 2023, the teacher has ended up in tears. My son's kindergarten teacher cried because she could no longer set up creative centers for her students, and that year she quit. The next year, my son's first grade teacher cried too, telling me that she couldn't respond to her students' excited questions about a lesson on echolocation because she had to stick to an admin-enforced script. She quit too. Anyone who has taught And anyone who has ever had a good teacher knows that good teaching involves dialogue, improvisation, autonomy, and time to build relationships. It involves taking time for digressions and saying the off-base thing that'll get you back on track. Biology professor Andrew Davenack makes a case like this in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, recounting how going off script and abandoning the lesson plan, moments that are, quote, moments that our modern assessment frameworks struggle to recognize, accommodate, or even permit, are in fact the very moments when education is most alive. Right? Just because something can be measured, he reminds us, doesn't make it meaningful. So now it's year 3 of the TEA takeover, and when I go for the parent-teacher conference, my son's second grade teacher seems kind of resigned. She has figured out, though, how to get the students to act when the district spies arrive for a spot check, like the teacher described in the Houston Chronicle, who has her students hide books under worksheets when the clipboard crew comes in. And I was feeling kind of good in the meeting about the fact that my son has a teacher who knows how to sneak around the district. And then she said something that stopped me cold. As much as I can, she tells me, I try to make this feel like a normal second grade. As much as I can, I try to make this feel like a normal second grade. What have we done to our teachers, our schools, our districts, our students? What perverse incentives have we embraced so that the semblance of normality becomes a coping strategy and maybe even the best case scenario? As Caleb and I wrote at the end of our op-ed, this is what it looks like to adopt a school reform plan on the model of a Silicon Valley boardroom, with its ethos of moving fast and breaking things in the name of efficiency and innovation. So let's come back to the university classroom. We already know that state houses, including in Texas, are rapidly eroding the independence of public universities and schools, from disbanding faculty senates to keyword searching syllabi. They're also handing over curriculum development to technologists with no background in education. I'm talking about entrepreneurs trying to replace human educators with robots. Melania Trump is only the latest to jump on this train. It was already moving. This is not just a war on public education. Private universities with relative financial autonomy are also complying in advance with the corporate annexation of our classrooms. Private universities are also chasing edtech fads, parroting the discourse of inevitability around AI, forging institutional partnerships that will impact teaching and research but without consulting any faculty, inviting corporate product experts to campus to train students to use tools that can boost their productivity and relieve them of the burden of their coursework, tools built on the appropriation of other people's intellectual and creative labor. With all due respect, I didn't spend 7 years earning a doctorate to learn how to teach from a Google product expert. And our students didn't come to university to learn how to learn from Google product experts either. Now, before I say any more, I have 2 disclaimers. First, when I refer to AI, I'm talking about the commercialized tools that have been insinuated into our classrooms, as well as the hypostatized entity we are being asked daily to engage with. So I'm talking about this fantasy object that is reordering university priorities, cannibalizing budgets, and distracting many of us, myself included clearly, from what would otherwise be our work. I do recognize that a research university engages a very broad range of AI tools. So to borrow Hollis Robbins' typology, these are LLMs, predictive systems, scientific machine learning models, computer vision, optimization systems, recommendation engines, and so on. And I leave it to the specialist researchers to debate their targeted ethical development. A second disclaimer. Let's not mistake critical responses to AI, including this one, as dismissals of or prohibitions on what multidisciplinary AI research has been, could have been, and might yet be. I acknowledge, of course, that there is genuinely exciting, philosophically and theoretically challenging work to be done on artificial intelligence broadly defined, and that's been done. My father came to this country to do a PhD in artificial intelligence in 1981. In literary studies, distant reading methods have raised profound questions about literary history, genre, the publishing industry. Scholars across fields have used AI to push the bounds of understanding about language, logic, and reason. Fiction writers like Vahini Vara have performed moving experiments with AI. And from this perspective, it's actually quite sad that AI research is being colonized and commercialized by tech corporations. But it is. And this we have to resist. We have to resist AI tools that produce gains for shareholders and create work for educators while contributing to our devaluation in the process. We have to refuse to give up our domains of knowledge to technologists who do not value our children or students, young people, the AI vulnerable, to quote my colleague Ian Schimmel, who have not yet had the privilege of learning how to read, write, and think for themselves. Because there is a difference, as Cal Newport observes, between AI augmenting thought and AI automating thought. Cognitive strain, Newport writes, is at the core of the entire post-Paleolithic human experience. It's at the core of all big ideas. It's at the core of empathy, morality, ethics, notions of justice and human rights, and religion and philosophy, end quote. So the most important thing we have to give our students might be the knowledge that knowledge doesn't come easy, and that thinking is hard. Newport's been using an analogy that I find myself reaching for as well, of going to the gym and having a machine lift the weights for you, right? That's what outsourcing your brainstorming and writing to an LLM is like. What is the point? We all know what happened to our mental maps when we gave them up to the GPS. And our collective cognitive fitness is not the only thing at stake. Counter to what university administrators seem to believe, or at least some of them, students and faculty are not clamoring to use AI tools. Tech companies are aggressively pushing them. As Audrey Waters puts it, and she says it starkly, quote, "The future the vast majority of people want." Let me start that again. The future the vast majority of people want for themselves, for their children, is not one in which we can only afford to buy digital replicas of products because everything that's actually real is only accessible to the rich, where we're all yanked around by algorithms, where there are no jobs, where there is no art, only slop, where there is no green space, no wilderness, no water, because the planet is covered in the data centers that power this destruction, end quote. Do you remember the ad for the iPad Pro called Crush, in which Apple executives told us exactly what they think of art, music, literature, chess, by literally showing it all get crushed? When someone tells you who they are, believe them. We should be clear-eyed about what we are facing. In Empire of AI, journalist Karen Howe analogizes OpenAI to the British East India Company, because it too, she argues, uses resources that are not its own, mines data that is publicly available, exploits labor, and monopolizes knowledge production. Tech companies like to say that they're innovating for the good of humankind, but really, as Brian Merchant observes, they're just seeking out new revenue sources amid an already digitally saturated world. So we are the new revenue source. We are the ones who are being fracked, from whom value is being extracted. And in the meantime, these companies are hugely misallocating resources and encouraging further misallocation, irresponsible and self-defeating misallocation by others. As San Francisco State professor Ronald Purser recounts, universities all over the country are signing multi-million-dollar partnerships with tech corporations at the same time that many are enacting budget cuts, closing academic programs, sending threatening voluntary separation notices to faculty, and enforcing austerity. This is not investing in education, Purser writes, it's outsourcing it. I want to underscore one word I just used, self-defeating. The university is a civic institution with a public mission, right? Even private universities have a public mission. And as legal scholars Woodrow Hartzog and Jessica Silby write, quote, AI systems are built to function in ways that degrade and are likely to destroy civic institutions. The affordances of AI systems erode expertise, short-circuit decision-making, and isolate people from each other. They are anathema to the kind of evolution, transparency, cooperation, and accountability that give universities their purpose and sustainability, end quote. So a couple weeks ago, I was at another private university in the South where there was buzz about $1 billion AI initiative, and its pillars sounded kind of familiar. New centers, committees, trainings, workshops, grant programs, a cluster hire, a splashy website. And maybe it's not actually $1 billion, but it's undoubtedly a huge investment. And why? Why are we trying to automate human intelligence when we already have human intelligence that remains profoundly underdeveloped, untapped, underutilized, even suppressed? Why automation? Why energy-intensive data centers when we have so much work to do to encourage human potential and democratize educational opportunities just next door at the public schools down the street? Instead, HISD is piloting Future 2 AI schools. Remember when we thought the revolution would be tweeted? Then what happened? Why would we believe that technologists who are pathologically unreflective, to use Thomas Chatterton Williams' description, have any interest in improving educational outcomes for anyone? Why would we trust AI, the ultimate unaccountability machine, as Waters puts it, to teach our students to be accountable to themselves, to each other, and to the earth? This is why, right? All of this is why there is a widespread movement building against AI, unmasking the AI con, and organizing against the machines. This is why scholars and journalists are trying to expose AI's imbrication with the military-industrial complex and the profound classism of its deployment in state universities, community colleges, and K-12 schools. This is why 4Cs, the major professional organization for writing and composition studies, just passed a resolution affirming students' rights to use their own language in the classroom. University faculty are not coming out against AI because we are a tradition-bound, reactive, out-of-touch elite. It's because we know that education should not be a luxury good. So we now have an opportunity to re-ask some fundamental questions. What is a university? How does it relate to its various constituencies, including students, alums, parents, faculty, state governments, corporate and private donors? What responsibilities does a university have to these constituencies when their interests conflict? As Rice graduate student Zainab Abdali asked at this weekend's terrific TAD symposium, what if universities were genuinely as invested in the local as they are in their national and global profiles? And what is our job as faculty? Who are our publics? What would it mean to truly stand with K-12 teachers in districts like HISD? Mike Miles and TEA have cast HISD teachers and community advocacy groups as the enemy. University faculty, too, have withstood years of incursions into our classrooms, from course management platforms to MOOCs to Zoom. Again and again, we are called to defend academic freedom. We know what it's like to be asked to reskill as users of unwanted technologies, even as we are also de-skilled by corporate innovators masquerading as the experts on our work. So let's be the experts on our own work. To cite Waters again, the tasks that AI promises to automate because they're supposedly low value are actually constitutive of the work of teaching and learning. Writing syllabi, communicating with our students, grading, lesson planning, writing papers, editing papers, reading, making study guides. That is the work, Waters writes. That is the work. Our work, the work of what I've been calling, in shorthand, the literature classroom, is teaching students how to question received wisdom and common sense, to interrogate ready-made ideas, to think across scales, to think abstractly, to query mediated representations, to make art, to think for themselves. We have to equip our students to fully inhabit their lives. We impart skills that reflect and enable the cultivation of key values: complexity, contradiction, wisdom, tradition, creativity, storytelling, community, dialogue, difference, expertise. Not innovation, not disruption, not efficiency, not moving fast and breaking things, but thinking deliberately and making meaning, right? Not productivity for production's sake, but knowledge production, which I think you'll agree is the reason we have universities in the first place. Thank you.